Alrighty, let's get underway. I will go ahead and start with our introduction. Welcome to the LD4 2022 conference, Linking Global Knowledge. I'm Jim Hahn, I'm the session facilitator. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to highlight a few resources of interest to our attendees to help navigate the conference. Over here, we have our conference website. Importantly, there we have our code of conduct. I dropped the link there in the chat. If you're on social tweeting, you can go ahead and use this hashtag LD4 2022 for linked data conference tweets. We're also able to offer tech support on our Slack. If you haven't joined our Slack yet, I'll just put the invite. Oh, no, I didn't. Let me put the invite here. There's that. There's the code of conduct. All right. So the links are now in the chat. So just a final note, we are recording or streaming to YouTube everything. So if it's not streamed right to YouTube, you'll be able to find it at a later time on our YouTube presence. This particular session is getting streamed. With that, I will stop my share and introduce our speakers. We have, let's see, Buddha Khan, Cornell University, software and UX developer with a focus on linked data applications and discovery. Our second speaker is Astrid Usong, Stanford University UX designer with focus in linked data and discovery. Our third speaker, Stephen Folsom, Cornell University metadata librarian with a focus on metadata strategy, including linked data and discovery. So thanks so much. I will hand it off to our speakers.
Thank you, Jim. Okay. So thank you, everyone. You will notice a spice theme that is kind of prevalent in these slides. We were trying to stay consistent with the names we tend to come up with our phases. So we're going to begin with a little bit on background and motivation for this work in general. What we're trying to do with respect to linked data and discovery. We're actually going to be talking about two projects. Again, there's a lot of ground that's covered in the slides, which we may not get to, which is perfectly fine because A, you have the slides, B, you can reach out to us on Slack or through email. And there are also links at the end of the slides if you want to learn more about, especially the first project. And for both of these sort of sections of the presentation, we'll also have a few minutes where we talk about future possibilities. So I think at this point, I'm assuming everyone has heard about the LD4 family of grants. We're currently in the last, the current one is in the last of a long series. And this particular grant is focusing on creating a working model of a complete cycle for library metadata creation, sharing, and reuse, funded by Andrew W. Mellon. Our particular work that we'll be talking about in this presentation covers the discovery part of the grant, where we're interested specifically in looking at how we can use and integrate linked data into our discovery environments to help support users. And we've done this primarily in two different ways. We'll touch on both of those in the presentation. One of our projects, the one we start with, is really about the work that we ended up integrating into our Cornell production catalog. And our second project that we'll talk about is more experimental. And the motivation behind a lot of this work is, when it comes to us trying to integrate linked data, is trying to understand what sorts of contextual information we can bring in to help our users see which authors and subjects might be of interest to them, and how works relate to each other. And throughout our experiments and our production work, we're thinking about how we can link this information back to our catalog resources and how we can do it in a way that extends our existing navigational structures, our existing informational structures. We want to be able to supplement what we have there and make things easier for users. Those are sort of our two main motivations. So we'll start off with the first project, and this is called Discovery Across Subject Headings, or DASH. And again, there are other presentations we've done on this, so we will not cover every single detail that we've already done, and there are links at the end of the slides if people want, but we do want to provide an overview of this work. The motivation behind this work was integrating information about authors and subjects. So specifically authors and subjects, what information we can bring in. And what we'll do right now is we'll show you a little bit about how our catalog behaved prior to the work that's been integrated now. We'll show you what these features look like in production. We'll do a quick run through of some of the data and architecture that makes that work possible. And we'll also do a very short recap of some of the process that led to the integration and production. So our user testing and our feedback process with our implementation team and user representatives. Thanks to Stephen for finding this. So this is sort of an overview of our, it says Discovery Across Subject Headings, but it's also authors. But it's a good acronym. So at this point, let's go back to where we were before we did the integration. We have, and still do, we have separate author and subject browse indices that capture information about our authors and our subjects. And we have an info button next to the author. So I'm going to show you what that looked like in these screenshots from the past. So we're looking at an item, and this is Middlemarch. This was our info button, and this is our little info box or knowledge panel of your. And you can see works by and works about. If you clicked on full record, it would need to advance the slide. It would take you to this page, which showed the information that we have in our author index right now, including things like place of death and other reference info. So this was what we had in the past. We do not still, and did not in the past, have subject info buttons, but we do have a subject browse index. So you could go, for instance, to see more information about the Russo-Japanese War. And this shows you the kind of information we were capturing, like broader term and alternate form. And this is still, I'm sorry, I want to make sure I'm, okay. Anyway, so that's where we were. And this is where we are now. So here's our production catalog as it exists currently. We have this, which is a little bit more easy to read than before. It says author info. If you click on it, it populates this little knowledge panel. And now we have more information in this knowledge panel, including this image and short description from Wikidata. And we're highlighting a few more pieces of information from our own underlying index. And if you clicked on view full info, it would take you to this page, which now brings in the image from Wikidata for George Eliot, brings in a DBpedia description. And in addition to some of the information we already have in our index, is bringing in citizenship and education information from Wikidata. Towards the right, you can see that we still have total works by and about, but we've broken that out now by format. And this is another linked data nugget where we're going to the Library of Congress to get information for this authority and pull out the classification, which allows us to generate this link to the call number browse. So if you were interested, you could see where George Eliot's works sort of fall into our call number browse. And at the very end, if you were interested, you could also look at the LCNAF record and itself. So this is our current production browse for subjects. We now have this little subject info button, which clicking on that will take you to a page that resembles the layout for the author page. It's got the image, it's got the description from DBpedia, it has the call number browse, and then our other information from our subject index with a link to LCSH if you wanted to look at that. So I think I'm in slideshow mode. It's kind of difficult to tell for some reason in this here. Here we go. So how did this happen? And there's a lot that's going on that's combining information that's already in our solar indices, using the identifiers and headers we have to look up URIs that then allow us to grab information from other sources using their APIs, and then bring all that back into the Blacklight UI. I'm going to touch on the sort of main parts here very quickly, but what you saw on the page for any external data that's coming in, those are all client-side requests. They do rely on our pre-existing author and subject indices with their headings. And we also implemented features for hiding pieces of information, and I'll get to what we mean by that in a minute. When we've talked about this work before, people have often asked what our system looks like in general. So this is a very partial overview, but of the parts that are most relevant to the work that we're presenting. So our ILS is Folio, and that is what fuels or runs provides the data for our main bibliographic index, which is Solar. We have authorities information for authors and subjects and other pieces of information that are used to populate the author and subject indices. And all of these indices then are what the discovery layer uses to show information, and our discovery layer is Blacklight. So to do a recap of what's happening in our integration, we start with the George Eliot subject heading, and that's a string still in our index. So we have to look up the URIs. We use the id.loc.gov to get the URI. And because we now have the URI, we can get the JSON LD for that, which allows us to grab the classification information that's relevant, that then allows us to make the call number browse link. Once we have the URI, we also use that to then query Wikidata for the additional pieces of information that you've seen in the page. And then we can use that QID and the label to also query DBpedia, and we're doing that primarily for the description. So the way it works right now is if there is not a DBpedia description, it will show the Wikidata description, and our knowledge panel shows the Wikidata description because it's usually shorter. So this is an overview of how these, pieces of information fit together. So if you have a Library of Congress URI, you can query Wikidata to find the equivalent Wikidata entity and then grab the properties that you're seeing that we're then integrating into the page. So I'm going to go through this very quickly, but again, there's a documentation and presentations. I just want to kind of point out that the pages for both authors and subjects are combining information from multiple sources. So on this page, all of these boxes point to information that we have in our author index, and that was being displayed before we did this integration. It's not in this particular layout that the pieces of information were still present. So if the occupation and birthplace, for instance, was available in the author index, this page would show that. And what we've done is, in addition to kind of redesigning the page a little bit, we're now bringing in the Wikidata image, the DBpedia description, the specific Wikidata fields that have a little asterisk on the interface, so you can see that they're coming from Wikidata. Sorry, the classification link, or the call number browse link that's generated using the Library of Congress classification information, and the authority URI link at the bottom. And we also took the works by and about and broke that out by format. So if you clicked on books, for instance, that would be all the books that are both by and about George Eliot, and you could see that on a format basis. Similarly, with the subject page, we have information that we had before, like the alternate forms and the broader terms, but we're bringing in Wikidata, image, DBpedia description, the call number links, and the heading link. And as I mentioned before, we're also working on hiding information. So why are we hiding information if we went to the trouble of getting it the first place? Because there might be issues where there are ethical concerns. There may be issues where we have concerns about the particular data source comprehensiveness or correctness. There might be updates or inaccuracies that we have to deal with. And so what we did is, to implement that, we have ways where we can specify if we want all the information for a particular subject or author heading to be hidden, or if we only want to hide specific properties. So for instance, on the left, these are excerpts from a YAML file that sits within the Blacklight app. And so that can be edited where if we wanted to hide every external piece of information, so that means we wouldn't hide what we have in our own author index, but we would hide any Wikidata or DBpedia info. We would just specify the heading, the string heading, and in this way on the left, and then that information would not be displayed. The example on the right shows how you could specify very specific properties and make the display not show just those pieces of information. So if you only wanted to hide the image, but you wanted to bring in the description still and the other pieces of information, this is one way to do that. So we've talked about the overall process before, again, in other presentations. Here I'll just say that this took some time. We began with mockups and prototypes that I'll very quickly show you in a minute, and did some usability testing that Astrid will talk about. And once we had a revised prototype based on the results of the testing, we took that, we had some additional mockups. We had multiple conversations. So the April and August dates are when we went to the user representatives for our library catalog, who are in charge of trying to understand how to enhance and improve the catalog and which features should go in. And once we had those multiple conversations and they had given us their feedback, we were able to then provide a set of features that could go into production. So we'll talk about the overall and usability testing in a minute, but this is to show sort of where we started and the additional things we had. So in addition to what you saw in production, we also had the idea of for a publication timeline, which brought in publications from Wikidata for the author. We had an influence graph, which was again using the influence relationship from Wikidata to provide this set of people who influenced this author and who were influenced by this author. And for our subject page, we had a very different design for the author page. And we also wanted to experiment with a timeline view where we, in addition to Wikidata info, we were integrating information from Period O. So this shows a map and timeline view for this subject. And then again, we had mockups. We showed people, our user representatives, that showed different options for designs for the author and subject page. So I'll let Astrid talk about the usability results.
Hi, I'm Astrid. I apologize for being tardy to the party. My Wi-Fi has been unstable and it continues to be. So if I freeze, can someone just wave at me and then I will have to reboot and try to quickly get back on. So, with all these improvements, and if you have previously seen the Huda, Astrid, and Steven show, you know this is just one of the many improvements that we've been making throughout the catalog. So you may have heard of Kapow, Bam, Wham, Smash, and now Dash and Bang. And if you want to know what all those things are, you can come to our Discovery Affinity Group meeting. And so we're not trying to replace or surpass Google or Amazon in terms of search capability, but we do think we can make the library catalog a bit stickier. So imagine all these amazing, relationships and information that we're putting on the pages to be kind of like a layer of honey, and it makes it sticky. So then people don't have to go off to Google or other places to look for this information. They can find all this helpful contextual information right on the catalog itself. And so with Dash, we interviewed about 5 undergrads. They were, think alouds. We did them one-on-one. We had tasks for finding them. And then we have some high-level takeaways from it. And, if you want to get into the trenches with us, you can come to one of our upcoming affinity meetings, and then, we'll go over like the detailed information, like, oh, they didn't click here or they clicked here. And, we can go over all that data with you. But the there are a few things like the info button. We weren't, we weren't focused on testing that necessarily, but like we found that, it didn't necessarily look clickable. So we need to put an affordance on it to make it look clickable and those sorts of things. And, text labeling, things we have to refine, but otherwise, like, if you can go to the next slide, Huda, everything was pretty well received. This was all additional information that could help them, either stay on the catalog and continue to do their research, or perhaps even take them to different discovery pathways that they may not have thought of. And so there were a couple of areas that we had that had data concern, which were the influence graph and publication timeline. And then, we wanted to also like clarify the interactivity between the map and timeline, because it was a lot of information. And, if they weren't familiar with that particular UI pattern, they might not necessarily know how they interact together. So if you can go to the next slide. And then, do you want to talk about this one?
I think that's Stephen.
Oh, Stephen.
Right. So as Huda mentioned earlier, that we have this, so I'm here to talk about future possibilities and how to make this work more sustainable, or make reactions to things that we learned throughout the usability process, or talking with technical services folks. So as Huda pointed out, there's that idea of hiding information that where we've made a connection, and that can happen for any number of reasons. But the thing I want to point out here is that currently, as it is a YAML file in some code, and it could be that we train technical services folks to go in there and amend that list of hidden entities or hidden statements, and or we could integrate that disallowing into cataloging tools. Cornell, for as long as I've been around, has had a interest in URIs and MARC. We continue to have that interest, and yet a lot of this code relies on the presence of authorized access points, and eventually we can make more assertive links in our data with the presence of URIs. You saw a lot of hoop jumping, where we would start at id.loc.gov and then go to Wikidata, then go to DBpedia. It might be that in some cases we might want to link directly to those quote unquote non-traditional authorities. There was feedback on certain relationships that we were trying to surface, including influenced and influenced by, where the data wasn't really, it brought up more questions than useful context, and we may want to go to different data sets where we would find similar information to be a little bit more trustworthy or fuller. What else here? There are some properties where when we got feedback, they're like, oh, but I know that person's also of this other nationality too. And so we just, there are small things like allowing the display of multiple nationalities that we just will have to integrate into the tool. And the lovely thing about being a blacklight library is we can continue to get feedback from users, or initiate new projects like Dash, where we can have more, continue to leverage subject headings in our discovery.
Okay, so I think I'm just going to really quickly try to look at this question. One of the questions is, most discovery layers focus on person and work. I'm curious if there have been requests to include classification browse search from experienced users. I don't know of such a request. I know that one of our early prototypes from LD4P2 was specifically looking at a way to link the sort of classification levels down to more LCSH levels, but I do not know of such a request. And then if other people from Cornell know, they can put it in the chat. So that was a lot. So take a quick, 10-second stretch break if you want. We're gonna dive right into the next section. So that project was work we've integrated into production, and a little bit of a background of how we got there. This phase, which is also has an acronym, a bibliographic access newly GUI'd. I'm pretty sure if not all of these phase names, I can attribute to Stephen, but I think that one definitely, and Dash as well. And so in the previous project that we were talking about, we were focusing on authors and subjects as our sort of main entities of concern, and how we could bring data in from other sources to supplement what's in the catalog. In this phase, we were focusing on work-to-work relationships and others, any sort of work instance relationships and contextual information. We were asking, how can we bring in information from other sources? How can we utilize sources that are, for instance, cataloged in Sinopia, and utilize those relationships? And what do linked data sources provide us that could help us find related catalog items, find relationships between catalog items? So that's sort of a broad overview of the project or phase itself. We're going to focus first on the prototype that we built and then tested, where we're modeling information in Sinopia and then trying to bring that in. There is a bullet about analysis of other linked data sources. We may not get to it, but we will be covering that in greater detail in our Discovery Affinity Group meeting next week. So you do not need to feel slighted in the least. This is an earlier rendition of the sort of dream behind closing the loop. So we have information that is being cataloged in the Sinopia cataloging, linked data cataloging editor being developed at Stanford. And the question is, if you think of the sort of main library systems, the ILSs, the discovery layers that are sitting on the mainland, how do we get that information from Sinopia to the mainland and back? And that's sort of a big part of, or conceptually a big part of how to close the loop. So we're hoping that what we're going to show you is sort of our kind of preliminary steps in imagining this world, where the mechanics, the resulting mechanics might be different from what we come up with, but conceptually we can look at how these relationships that are modeled in Sinopia might support discovery. Thanks to Astrid for taking the Dune image and making it an LD4P3 one. As part of our demo and our examples, there's going to be a lot of Dune, and that's just how it ended up, where we were looking at works that had different adaptations and translations and sequels, and that this became our main go-to. So what we're going to do is show you the prototype, but before we do that, we'll show you what's in production right now. So this is sort of the opposite way that showed the Dash work, where we went to the past. Here we're going to go to the present and then talk about what the prototype does. So imagine, if you will, that you have looked for, and you might be surprised here, Dune, and you found a catalog result for it. And this is what our item looks like in the Cornell catalog, where you have information. If you were to think about this in terms of works and instances, it sort of combines that. And then at the bottom right, we have this other forms of this work. This is fueled by a 2015 copy of an OCLC work ID concordance, which basically says these other publications of Dune, with whatever dates they might be, are also Dune. So if you click on that link, you can see this page that shows you there's, based on this concordance, there's 4 other items, and then you can filter by facets some more. So now I'm going to show you what our prototype does. So one thing we did is we took the information and kind of rearranged it a little bit, starting with the work level info and then going to the instance info. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then what we did is we've got the other copies, and there are actually 4 other copies that we have listed here. So a total of 5 items, not 4 items, I think, is what you see in other forms. And then we have listed here the sequels. And there's a link at the bottom that says explore all related items. And again, this is a prototype, not production, just FYI. And if you go to explore all related items, you see this description coming in from DBpedia, some of the information from the preceding record, the author, language, and subject, and the image. But then you have these relationships as well. You already saw copies of Dune and sequels on the first page. But in addition to that, on the right side, you have translations. So this is, we have a Thai translation of Dune. We have a movie in our catalog that's an adaptation of this. We have this book that's specifically about this work, not just about Dune, the fictional place, but this particular, publication, this work. And then we also have other items by the author. And so we generated this prototype. And what I'm going to talk about now is kind of stepping back and going over like what we just saw. So one of the, I mentioned works and instances, but one of the first and fundamental questions we had to try to answer was how these two very different paradigms, the catalog and how information is presented in BIBFRAME, and this also applies, at a higher level to Ferber or any other such paradigm. How do you map from one to the other? And so since we're doing Dune, of course, we have Timothy Chalamet asking what's in the Sinopia box and being told that it's BIBFRAME. And really, this one is about as kind of the conceptual confusion at first, at least that I personally faced, which was, if I'm talking about a catalog record, what am I talking about in BIBFRAME and vice versa? So where are these, links happening? And so, in BIBFRAME, you have work, instance, and item. In our catalog, we've got a bunch of mark data, which we then put in a Solar index, which we then display in blacklight. So we know, I knew how it's implemented, but how does this on the left translate to what's on the right? And we often talk about, I think, or at least we've heard about how works and instances, that information is combined in a catalog record. But what was really helpful was to think about something that I think Paul Frank earlier in the week said, what we catalog are manifestations. So if you think about from an indexing point of view, or from the number of pages that are available to you in blacklight corresponding to catalog records, we have as many of those as we have instances. So one way to think about this is that it's really each catalog record kind of corresponds to an instance. And you can say that, for instance, for example, here you're seeing these 3 catalog records correspond to 3 different instances of the same work. So what we've done is we've gone into Sinopia, we've modeled the Dune work, we've modeled the separate instances, and we've also modeled work-to-work relationships that I don't show here, but Stephen will go into greater detail about. And so once you have that information in Sinopia, we've also captured the identifiers for the instances. And one of the reasons we've done that, the primary reason, is if we had just work and instances, how will we know which of those instances corresponds to which catalog record? So we use these identifiers as sort of our bridge between these two worlds. And we use that to be able to look up the equivalent catalog record in the library. So you might be asking, perhaps, so this shows you a Sinopia overlay over the catalog, but once you're on a catalog item, how do you know what the other instances are and what the work is? And we did that by including the Sinopia URI in the mark itself. So again, not production, our copy of the production catalog. And our prototype relies on seeing this URI that represents the work within the mark display field. And then we can pull that in and then do queries against or get the URI in Sinopia, get the instances that belong to it, get any of the relationships between the works, and pull that out, do queries against our own catalog using the identifiers, and show that information in the page. So I'm going to hand it over to Stephen now to talk about the nitty-gritty.
Right. So as you saw on that last page, the mark display has a field where, so we're following the PCC URIs and mark recommendations where a 758 can be used to connect a bib to a work. And then once in that work, we're using ISBNs, LCCNs, and or OCLC numbers in Sinopia to link back in the instance records to link back to the catalog. And these slides are intended to talk about the work-to-work relationships. So there's a whole section in the Sinopia template that I use that focuses on work-to-work relationships. It encourages it. And so that's what's happening here. This is a little snippet from the Dune work where we say it has a sequel, Dune Messiah. And maybe a thing to point out here is that I pull from the RDA registry these relationship designators. So I'm not just pulling them out of a hat. I did try to follow our standards. This is a generalized pattern in Sinopia for a general relationship, and that little literal there helps to qualify that relationship to say that it's an RDA has SQL relationship. Similarly, and as Astrid has pointed out when we were thinking about this area of work, one of the challenges in catalogs is knowing whether or not the thing you're looking at is the work or contains the work. We joke around, especially Shakespeare examples, this being the case where the title of a thing about Hamlet is also titled Hamlet. So yes, Mark allows this, right? We can use the 600 block to link to works, but again, Sinopia really thinks about works and their relationships. So we were able to capture that here with is subject of. So the art and soul of Dune has the subject of Dune, the work. Adaptations, similarly, just again, pulling from the RDA registry is adapted as a motion picture. And a thing to point out here is that for each of the works that we related, I created a separate work in Sinopia with the exception of the movie, because they're in the production environment that I was working in, there wasn't a readily available moving image template. So in this case, it was a great opportunity to link out to the id.loc.gov work for the motion picture. This slide just shows from the work that is Dune that we had multiple instances in our catalog. I created multiple instances here, and on each of these instances is identifiers that we find in the MARC record so that we could tie that all back together again, close the loop, if you will. And here's an example of that. So for this particular instance, we have an ISBN and an LCCN. So I touched on a little bit of this, but for those familiar with Sinopia, we use the unnested monograph template from the production environment. You wouldn't be able to tell from the screenshots, but we didn't fully catalog the works and instances in Sinopia. It was really about collecting the work-to-work information and the related instance IDs. All of the bibliographic description that you see on the page otherwise is really coming from the MARC record. So that is all data in the Solar Index already. Another callback to Paul Frank's talk earlier in this week, but he mentions the awkwardness of trying to capture for like relationships in MARC. We could have done that. We could have used the 700 block in BIBs, but again, it's not ideal. And we were testing this theory that it might be easier, better, more clearly captured in Sinopia. And I already covered that last point that we linked out to id.loc.gov for the moving image.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to hand it over to Astrid, but as I mentioned, we did do user testing. We just finished last week. And the sort of questions we were interested in were, A, if the design of the pages, obviously, can they get to and easily access the information that we're presenting? We also wanted to ensure they can still see the availability information and that whatever changes we make does not hinder that. And we also asked if the tasks that we were asking them to do and the kinds of information that we were presenting would be useful and or if they would do it themselves. So Astrid, I'll hand it over to you now.
So again, here we're trying to make the catalog stickier and more helpful. Can we get them the right appropriate amount of information in a way that is helpful for them and in a way that they can use it? So we recruited a variety of users, grad, undergrad staff, asked them to complete tasks. We randomized who saw the prototype versus the catalog first. And again, overall, we see some positive results. I think I'm talking to the next slide, Huda, if you want to go one. Yeah. And so, this is the task summary. Then we asked them to look for other options. So like if the Dune that you looked up was checked out, can you find other options quickly? Can you find a Thai translation, the movie adaptation, etc. If you go to the next slide. So the results are, we see some positive results. The prototype with the related items revealed on the page or, one click away in a very easy to navigate way was very helpful. And while you may say, well, this helps all the Timothée Chalamet fans find Dune, what about the rest of us? So, I might be looking up a textbook and my related items for that textbook might be, I want to see all the different editions. And so we could show that. So the point is not that like we can show sequels and movies and stuff like that. The point is that we show additional contextual information for the relevant item. And that helps people better, navigate the catalog, because currently the catalog is just not set up for it. And we saw a lot of people struggle when they use the current catalog to try to find this information. And so if you want to see these were the results for the current catalog site. They, I think if we were not sitting there and forcing them to use the catalog, like a lot of them would have bailed and gone to Google and looked up, Dune movie or Dune Thai translation and then found the item and then come back to the catalog to look for it because they were just having so much trouble finding things on here and understanding it. And we saw a lot of like just, some common user errors, well, I guess not user errors, design errors that we need to fix with the catalog. So follow-up questions. So again, like, what does this mean for the general population? Maybe you're not looking up sequels, translations, movie adaptations, but maybe you want all the items in the series, or maybe you want all the editions of that book that you are looking up. And, for different items, we could provide different contextual information. But overall, everything was useful. It's definitely useful to have everything in one place. And again, it kind of helps them, not only helps them find the thing they're looking for, but potentially helps them to, to other discovery pathways that they might not have thought of.
Sorry, my fingers were sticky. Yeah, so thanks, Astrid. We do have another section here, but we also have only 3 minutes. So I think we can kind of just quickly say that we did do a lot of data analysis that was looking at, for instance, sources like ShareVDE, PCC data, and LOC hubs. Can we pull out identifiers? So for instance, if you have a hub or an Opus that's aggregating multiple works and multiple instances, if you can grab those identifiers, that those are like ISBNs or LCCNs, those are related items. And then if you could then find things in the catalog or across catalogs, you could say those items are related. So similar to what we did in the prototype, where we utilize the relationships to understand how things are related very specifically, but then employ those identifiers that are linked at the instance level to then look up things in the catalog or catalogs that we can then say are related in a specific way. So I'm going to stop though for now, because now we have only 1 minute. There were some questions. I think one person was asking about the influence or influence by relationships. I think we've answered that in the Q&A. That's not in production, and one of the reasons was that data set, when people were looking at those properties, they said that's A, it's subjective, B, it's sort of not complete. As far as authoritative data versus not authoritative data, I think we've been very careful to label where the sources of information are coming from. And the great thing about sources like Wikidata are that if you see something that you think should be updated, there are avenues to do that. I don't know if there are any other questions, so I will stop for now, but I'll just, very sorry. This was all the other stuff that you can look at later. Future possibilities. I don't know if Stephen, if you want to do say a quick word about that, and then I just want to thank everybody, and they're all included in here. So go ahead, Stephen, if you want to talk to this at all.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to be cognizant of is that what we've shown you today would require changes in cataloging practice and in capturing more information than we currently do. And so while this isn't a presentation on FAST, I often get in trouble for advocating strongly for FAST or post-coordinated subject headings because they are easier to apply. And the thing I'd point out there is that it would free us up that's one example of where if we changed cataloging practice that we could free up time to capture some of this other information that we often have limited resources to capture. And like I said before, the forms themselves change cataloger behavior because they really do highlight some of these relationships. Yes, other future possibilities. So in Dash, the area work on subject headings, the info boxes are driven by authorized access points. We might do something similar with uniform titles or name titles in the mark. Again, it would be better if we have identifiers for those sorts of things in the records. And yeah, I think the trick here is not just to show that two works are related, but how they're related to that third bullet point there. The rest we've sort of all covered already.
All right. That's it. I think we're over time anyway. And all these people helped, so.
Thanks so much. That was a really great presentation. So much information there. I want to thank all of our speakers for sharing their expertise with us. And thanks everyone for the great discussion. Feel free to continue the discussion on the conference Slack. And also there's the discovery meetings coming up